Hi friends, welcome everyone to thank you very much for joining us for today's Digital Humanities Lab webinar. This is the fourth of 5 sessions that we're offering in 2022. And just before we start, I'd like to mention I live on and work on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to them as the traditional custodians on whose ancestral lands we gather today. I acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country and respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. As this webinar is online, and I know that we always get people joining from other parts of Australia, I extend that respect to relevant communities in other regions, and I especially welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be joining us today. The University Libraries created this webinar series in its 2nd year now to inspire and inform humanities researchers and their potential collaborators who are interested in using digital approaches in their work. And when I say potential collaborators, I have a really broad perspective on what that is. I mean researchers from other disciplines, representatives of the galleries, libraries, archives and museum sector, a couple of whom we have here today, students and whoever else is interested. We make an effort in these sessions to showcase real projects and real researchers that are using data, digital tools or digital research methods to drive, enrich or complement their research. Just in terms of housekeeping as we get started, today's session will be recorded and shared after the event on the University of Adelaide YouTube page. Attendees will not be able to be seen on screen, but all of our presenters will, and your question may be asked by me as the host. If you have any questions, please look to the bottom of your Zoom window and find the chat icon, and you can ask your questions in the window that pops up. They can be sent through at any time, and what we will do is we'll have our 2 presentations and I will pose those questions to our speakers at the end to help drive our discussion. We're hearing about 2 projects today, both of which have preservation and access to the past in mind. We're going to hear about how the State Library is preserving globally significant digital artworks from the 80s and 90s, and how researchers across disciplines are coming together to create digital experiences that capture lost built heritage in Adelaide, immersing the user in not just the space, but the archival history of the place. And so with that, first up, we have Kimberley and Taryn Ellis from the State Library of South Australia's Digitisation and Digital Preservation Services. In their work, they make efforts to ensure long-term preservation and access to South Australia's published and archival cultural heritage for public use. They're bringing their technical and information management expertise to this challenge and are key to implementing the library's digital preservation system, Preservica. So say hello to Taryn and Kimberley. They are joining us in person, but they've prepared their presentation as a video, which I will get started now.
Greetings, everyone. I'd like to start off by acknowledging we are on Kaurna land. The dreaming is still living from the past, in the present, into the future, forever. Greetings all. My name is Kimberley and I'm the Digitisation and Digital Preservation Team Leader at the State Library of South Australia. Today, Taryn Ellis, our Digital Preservation Technical Analyst, will be going into detail on a fascinating project, but I thought first I would provide you all with a bit of context about our digital collections. In total, we have approximately 160 terabytes of data with an annual growth rate of around 25 terabytes. This averages out to be around 35,000 images plus a few thousand audio and film editions annually. Around 3% of our total physical collection is digitised, and around 160 million individual objects. That's not too shabby. Our mandate is to collect items of significance relating to South Australia, which means we potentially collect any and all formats, including photographs, oral histories, floppy disks, pre-pressed newspapers. We even have a couple of donated computers. We obviously also collect born digital, but we also have specialist studios and staff for creating our Turn digital content. You can see here a little breakdown of our digital collections as a percentage, and I should probably add the disclaimer that our newspapers delivered through Trove and websites available through Pandora are not included in these figures. In June 2020, the State Library of South Australia announced that Preservica had been awarded the contract to provide SLSA's first digital preservation system. Our implementation plan incorporates both learning about the functionality of Preservica in a test site and implementing our production site, which we did last year. However, now we are needing to dissect what our digital objects are for ongoing preservation actions and considering policies and procedures to record this information as we approach ingest for our collections on a format by format basis. When it comes to our digital preservation projects, we want to do this once and do it right, or as right as we can with the information in front of us at the time. So in saying that, I'm now going to hand over to Taryn Ellis, who'll be discussing a fantastic project that we've completed and is now ingest ready. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Taryn Ellis. I'm a State Library of South Australia's Digital Preservation Technical Analyst. I moved to Adelaide to join the State Library in 2020, which was a very pestilential year, as we all will recall. I've been working in the cultural heritage sector since the early 2000s, where initially I specialised in imaging and digitisation before I moved across to digital preservation. Unsurprisingly, I guess with that background, I have a passion for art and technology, and also kind of weirdly, I guess, automation. And given that, this project has been an absolute dream for me to work on. Today, I want to briefly introduce the artist at the heart of this preservation project, that is Joseph Stanislaw Ostoja-Kotkowski, before outlining some of the more interesting challenges this collection has posed for preservation and talk about how we are handling or have handled some of those problems. I will aim to keep the technical detail to a minimum, which is hard for me, but bear with me, I will do my best. Ostoja-Kotkowski was born in Poland in 1922 and immigrated to Australia in 1950. During World War II, he'd studied drawing at a town in northern Poland, which obviously is a pretty fraught place to be at that point in time, before graduating from the Dusseldorf Academy of Fine Arts in Germany in 1949. He initially worked as a labourer when he moved to Melbourne, but he went back to school again and graduated from the VCA, which was then the National Gallery School, in the mid-1950s. Subsequently, he moved to the Adelaide Hills and took up residence just outside of Stirling under the patronage of the Booth family, and there he lived and worked for the next 40 years. During this time, he became a major Australian public artist, and his creative output included paintings, murals, theatre sets, films, sculpture, photography, digital imaging, obviously, and the kinetic audio productions and laser art shows for which he's probably best known. One of his laser works was actually featured on a postage stamp in 1985, which coincidentally was also the year that he dazzled audiences at the inaugural Adelaide Grand Prix with a laser concert at the Wayville Showgrounds. In 1992, he became a member of the Order of Australia for service to visual arts, and in 2008, the significance of his archive, a portion of which was also held at the University of Melbourne, was recognised, and it was inscribed in the Australian Register of the UNESCO Memory of the World. After his death in 1994, the State Library of Australia took custody of that archive, around 29 linear metres in total, and the material included film, video, photography, plans, documents, papers, and over 900 3.5-inch floppy disks. And it's these floppy disks that we're going to be discussing here today. This set of disks is a perfect example of the vulnerability of born digital material. It's a single copy of data held on unstable storage medium, in this case flexible plastic with adhesives and magnetic coating. It requires specialised or obsolete hardware to access. So think about disk drives and how hard they are to find now. And it also requires specialised, often obsolete software to run. So think about the disk drive drivers or an operating system that has access to these kind of disks. Data was saved to these disks between 1988 and 1994 using an early Acorn Archimedes computer, probably with one of the earliest versions of the RISC OS installed. And we can also talk about the contents of the disks. By 2020, the contents had become kind of folkloric around the library. We knew that about 800 of these disks contained digital artworks, and the remaining 100 plus were suspected to be software. But we also knew that the artworks were in a format known as a sprite file. But that was pretty much all we knew. Because preserving Stan's artworks had to be our first priority, we started our project by looking at the 800 artwork disks. Our first step was to stabilise the data To do that, we needed to get the data off the disk and into storage that we could manage, so storage that we could replicate and then we could back up. So we sorted a disk drive and we sorted some software, we got those working, and then we needed to work out how we were going to make the data on this accessible, because it's all very well to preserve it. In fact, it's very important to preserve it. But if you can't look at what you've preserved, then that's not really of benefit to anyone, right? Our initial plan was solid. We were going to image the disks, like copy the bits to a single file, and then we were going to load that file into an emulator. Then we'd extract the sprite files, the artworks, using original image editing software, and convert each artwork into a contemporary file format. But we did run into a few issues with this plan. It turned out that using the software, the original software to convert the files, risked accidentally editing the files. We also found it was extremely time consuming because each disk had 2 to 4 artworks on it, and each file had to be individually saved and renamed. And then we also found this other pretty wild problem. Look at the aspect ratio. I mean, wacky computer art, sure, it's not totally inexplicable, but then look at this next one. The title of this artwork is, well, it's sphere tree. It's a typo, but it's sphere tree. It's not egg tree. Something was getting a little bit weird here. Here is a correctly converted sphere tree. So what was the story? The story was that the original artwork files, the original sprite files, had rectangular pixels. And while Windows 7 was perfectly happy with our converted PNG files that had rectangular pixels, Windows 10 was not very happy about that and rendered them, as you saw, really strangely elongated. So that was just another one of those interesting little asides about the fragility of digital material. So given all of this stuff that was going on, we really had to take a step back and change tacks. We did a lot of research and a lot of skulking around obscure Archimedes and RISC-OS forums, and that led us to some great open source software. So I have to shout out then to Dr. David Boddy, who's a mathematician and physicist, and he provided some free to use open source stuff to the community, which allows us to extract individual files from a RISC-OS formatted disk image. And also credit goes to the German software developer Stefan Huber, who is a RISC-OS aficionado. He wrote a Java program that converts sprite files into PNGs. So we used these pieces of software and we scripted them into an automated workflow that managed to extract files and metadata, so file list, file size, last modified date, all of that stuff from the disk image, and then automatically converted them into PNG files. We were pretty happy with ourselves at that point. We were making good progress. At the end of the day, we'd go and look at what we'd done and we'd got these beautiful, beautiful PNGs. But then one day we noticed that something had changed. Yeah, weird, right? We looked into it and it turned out that we were actually dealing with 8 distinct variations of the sprite file. The technical name, I guess, technical term for that would be that these sprites were using different screen modes. Very broadly, a mode is a screen setting that defines how many and what color pixels will be displayed, and what type of pixels and how many pixels there are. In a sort of related twist, the sprite's color palettes, the color palette being a list of all the colors in an image that's stored in the file, these palettes no longer match the images. So here's an example. If you look at either of these images in the emulator, and you look at the box of colored squares, you'll notice that the colors represented in the images are not represented in the box of squares. So we had a look at that, for example, in Photoshop. That's what a palette for that image should look like. Yeah, so things were getting a bit weird. And also, just for extra fun, we found that a large subset of the files were in custom modes rather than in official proprietary registered modes, which meant that our emulator didn't know what to do with them. And that made it pretty hard to work out what, in fact, the images were supposed to look like. So there's an example. This is two different software trying to interpret the image file mandelalb. The top one does slightly better than the bottom one, but still not hugely convincing. So yeah, we had a lot of work to do. The steps that we took are pretty technical. So if technical detail is not something that you're particularly interested in, I suggest that now's probably a good time to hum like Eye of the Tiger or Fame theme song or whatever is your favorite training montage music. Just hum away and I will list the things that we did. So the solutions. We worked out that all the different modes, well, we worked out all of the different modes that were in use and we worked out which files were in which mode. And we did that by reverse engineering the sprite file format specifications and finding the byte offset that stores that mode number. Then we coded that into the automated workflow process to sort the files into different streams. Then we introduced and edited additional open source software to handle those custom modes. And then we superimposed a standard 256 color palette. And we took all of these changes and incorporated that back into the custom workflow. Okay, so what I just said can be summed up in these images. That is mandelalb having been through another iteration of edited custom software. And that is mandelalb once it had the correct palette assigned to it. We did a lot of testing at this point to compare our results, or the results that we were getting from this new workflow, against the images that we could actually view in the emulator. And then we compared both of those against transparencies from the STAN archive. These transparencies are actually pretty cool. They are literal screenshots, i.e. they are photos that Stoyakovsky took of his artwork as it was displayed on a computer screen. We have a few thousand of these. They've now been digitized, so you can have a look at them online. They weren't at the time, so we were holding up all these slides to lights and trying to work out which match what, which image. It was good times anyway. So we have here a comparison of a series of files showing the same image. On the far left, we have a PostScript file, so a file that was prepared for print, and that was an original file taken from a disk. We have a scanned screenshot, one of those transparencies I've just been talking about. We have an original TIFF, also extracted directly from a disk. And then finally, we have a PNG file that we migrated during our automated workflow process. Sorry, anyone who's looking at these on their phone. I could talk at length about color management, but I think maybe for now, what I'll just emphasize is that while the State Library owns copyright of this collection, we do still respect the moral rights of the artist, and we will be adding a note to the catalogue record to acknowledge that these images may vary slightly from the intent of the artist. I actually think we're doing pretty well here, but no, I won't go into the details. Anyway, we can talk about that later if anyone has any questions. So the upshot of all this is that we successfully automated the extraction and migration of more than 1,800 artworks from the first 800 discs, as well as collecting metadata that our colleague Dan Sun manipulated into spreadsheets that will provide the basis for the bulk creation of catalogue records. So yay. But then we had to tackle the remaining discs. And those discs were the software discs. We approached it with pretty much the same process that we'd had with the artworks, in that we imaged the discs to preserve the data. But then what do? The difficulty really lies in making this data accessible. When you think about software or an application, it's really, really different from an image file. It's a complex, dynamic, multi-part object that relies on the operating system to function. And also something to consider here is that these applications weren't created by Ostoja-Kokovsky. They actually represent the IP and commercial interests of third parties. And so while as a collecting institution, as a memory institution, we do have the right to preserve this data, how we share that data is a different matter. So when we began working with the unknown, probably software disks, we were presented with this new set of problems. In extracting the data from the disk, we generated a list of all the contents, including the metadata again. All of that is extremely useful. But we also extracted the applications, and we extracted the applications in all of their little component parts, which is a lot less useful. One way to think about this is a bit hokey, but just bear with me, is it's the equivalent of having disassembled clockwork rather than an actual watch. So a little more concrete example, please, Taryn. Okay. So here is an example of what the program read this looks like when it's separated from its operating system. And here's what it looks like via the emulator. It's just a little icon that opens a letter. This on screen is actually one of the coolest things that we found on these disks. I mean, there was a lot of really good stuff on here. We've got early image manipulation programs, we've got fractal generators, all of the stuff that actually gave us a lot of clues into Ostoja-Kokovsky's practice, as well as just being really interesting from a history of computer software perspective. But what we have here is an example of one of the many digital letters from a collaborator of Stan's, who is a Melbourne-based software developer. From reading these, we've learned a lot about the artist's interests and about his use of technology. Again, these letters actually provided a really useful strategy or really useful inspiration for how to provide some kind of access to the software disks. What we decided to do was to focus on the component files that were intended for humans to use, as opposed to those that were providing instructions for the computer. So when you think about that, you think about the files like help files or README text files. RISC-OS identifies this format as FFF, but in reality, they're just ASCII text files, and they can be read by any contemporary operating system. So if you can access them, you can write a Python program that finds them all and converts them to searchable PDF files. And these PDF files can then be easily read by the project archivist, and salient information can be added to the catalogue to explain who made the application and even sometimes what it does. And they can also be read online, copyright permitting. Access to the programs themselves, however, can only be provided via emulation. And this poses its own set of joys and problems. And I'm very, very happy to talk about those, but maybe not just now with the time limits on this presentation. So at the conclusion of this project, we've imaged all of the disks, and each preservation package will include a disk image, i.e. a copy of the disk, a picture of the disk, original artwork files, and access files in contemporary formats, so PNGs or PDFs. We are currently in the process of designing an ingest strategy to structure and store all of these files in our Preservica preservation system. One of our final steps was to write up a really detailed report on this whole process. So that included outlining all of the software we'd used, how we'd used it, and the interventions and the decisions that we've made along the way. We've also saved all of the custom software together with notes about its installation requirements and dependencies, just in case it needs to be used again. There are still so many avenues with this collection that is left to explore, but alas, I think they'll probably be for others. I'm pretty inspired actually though to start work on an AI and deep learning project to see if we can't link the original digital images that we've extracted with the screenshots that we saw earlier on slide film, but that's a discussion for another day. Any questions that you have, I'm more than happy to answer, and thank you so much for listening today.
Thanks so much, Taryn and Kimberley. That was really interesting. Such an incredible challenge that I'm overwhelmed by what you've had to do there. So next up, we're going to hear from about a team project from interdisciplinary collaborators. Aaron Humphrey, who is the head of the University of Adelaide's Digital Humanities program, will be presenting on a collaborative project with Steve Cook and Amit. It's true, I knew I was going to mess it up. Srivastava. So Aaron is an expert in media ecologies and user experience design with research interests in how technology remediates the past and how images are used to create community and national identities. Steve is a senior lecturer and head of the Realities Extended Business Unit with specialties in immersive technologies, VR, MR and AR, and mobile ubiquitous technology research and development. And Amit is based here at the School of Architecture with a research focus on modern architecture. His lab, which is the Contemporary Architecture Research Lab, is currently developing a website for modern architecture in Adelaide at adlmodern.com. Perhaps Karen can pop that in the window if you're interested in checking that out. But with that, I think I'm going to pass over to Aaron to start our presentation today, and everyone will join us for discussion at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexis, and thanks to Amit and Steve, who we'll hear from later today. Let me just share my screen here and get started. Okay. So I'm talking about a project that's currently in progress. So what I'm going to do is kind of lay out the framework, the questions that are guiding this project, and I'll show you where the project is at today. This is a project called Building Memories, Developing Urban Information Architecture and Data Sovereignty for Australian Cities. This is a collaborative project between myself in Media and Digital Humanities, Amit and his team from Architecture and Built Environment, and Steve, who's my colleague in the Department of Media, who has an expertise in virtual reality. So what we're doing with this project is building basically virtual models of historical buildings in Adelaide. And I'll talk about why we're doing that and some of the challenges and the buildings we've decided to look at, and I'll show you some of the work in progress. I do want to acknowledge, we've had some beautiful acknowledgements of country from South Australia. I'm currently in Massachusetts, so I'm located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what's now known as Boston and Cambridge. I'm here on a research sabbatical. I pay respects to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. Okay, so this is a project, we're talking about data sovereignty, and that's not something you necessarily connect with virtual reality. One of the reasons that we're looking at this project now is because I think for most people, the experience of a city in the 21st century involves a phone, right? Anytime I'm in a new city and anytime I'm going, where am I going? I'm looking at my phone. I'm looking at, maps. I'm reading reviews of places I might go, figuring out the best way to get public transport, right? Technology firms are and indeed have transformed our cities in really significant ways. Okay, so things like mapping and wayfinding applications don't just structure the way that people experience our cities, they also commodify those experiences. Right? There's a lot of money to be made in these things. And the big technology firms that are commodifying these experiences are largely based outside of Australia. So this isn't necessarily a problem, but it's a challenge and something that I think is important to think about as the way that we use Google Maps, other GPS programs, reviews of restaurants and things actually are changing our urban environments and kind of transforming what is valued in terms of our cultural heritage. So we can see, I'm sure you can think of plenty of examples of the way this changes the experience of being in a city and changes what is valued in that city. Okay, so that's happened now. On the future, probably is thinking about how is virtual reality going to affect this? I'm sure you're all aware of metaverse. right? I've used this screenshot that where Zuckerberg kind of got owned by, I don't know if you can see the headlines. This was a metaverse screenshot that everybody kind of made fun of. So I've got some headlines there. I think we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that they're going to do it this badly, although we'll see. But Metaverse and other Meta and other tech companies are trying to further transform our urban and physical environments through virtual and augmented reality. How's it going to work? There's been lots of talk about, creating virtual connected cities. So there are risks to our cultural heritage and our data sovereignty as these transformations begin to reshape our cities in different ways, right? Especially when these are publicly traded companies that are based outside of the communities that are being transformed. So we thought with this project, one thing that we wanted to do is look at, well, how can we start to get on top of this coming challenge to the cultural heritage and cultural memory of our environments? Because, looking into the horizon, there are going to be virtual copies of physical worlds. What do those look like? And do they threaten our memories of our existing memories of the past and our existing cultural heritage? So some of the architectural questions and challenges is, what is possible? What should be preserved of urban environments? What kind of systems can be established to archive and recreate historical environments? And how do people experience these things, right? It's one thing to say, yes, we can do it, but what's the experience like? I have a screenshot here that's, this is actual in-app footage. This is supposed to be Rome in AD 239, I believe. I don't know. There's something just funny about that to me. These are mediated experiences. They are not they're not the actual thing. And so what is that like? I also have a question here about, how can we understand this drive to recreate and re-experience the past? Because this isn't new. One of the buildings that we're looking at was an attempt at virtual reality in the late 1800s. So can we gain understanding of historical preservation attempts by looking at how people have tried to create experiences of the past in the past? So I guess looking at a meta, not the company, but a meta reality, a reality about the experience of reality. Okay, so one of the frameworks that we're using in this project is the idea of information architecture, which in a computer science sense is about ways of structuring information, including ontologies, that's the way that things are ordered, taxonomies, what things are called, and epistemologies, systems of knowledge that structure our understanding of the world or of reality. One of the things we're talking about with this project as well is thinking about information architecture, these structures as a mode of cultural heritage themselves. And also in a practical sense, a workflow that we have to use to recreate and experience this cultural heritage. So we have to develop within our teams an information architecture of bringing things from the archive to virtual reality. And also we're trying to look at what was the information architecture used to structure these things in the past, and how can we preserve that or at least respect that. Okay, a question I'm going to come back to at the end, and this is a framework I've been working with, is the idea of comprehension versus apprehension. So a lot of times when we talk about presenting or representing the past, we're looking at trying to get people to comprehend what it was like. It has the idea of comprehension, of course. And instead, I think a lot of what happens, especially with mediating virtual environments, is more of like apprehension. So in terms of you hold something, right? You can apprehend it, apprehend a criminal. So there's a sense of experience, and unlike comprehension, which suggests a fullness, apprehension suggests an uncertainty. And I think there is a sense of uncertainty when we look at these environments. Is that what it was really like? And so we're more, I think, in a relationship with these mediated environments than simply being told this is what it was like. As I mentioned, we had to develop a workflow. So I'm going to get out of the technical kind of conceptual side here and talk about what we've actually done. So we've tried to take historical research and archival records, build architectural models from them, and then develop them into virtual environments. We're using two buildings for case studies here. One is the Adelaide cyclorama, which I'll talk about second, and the other is Bonython House. So you can see here, one was built in 1890, the other was built in 1965. One is existent, Bonython House is still standing. Adelaide cyclorama burned down well over 100 years ago. So we're looking at one building that now only exists in historical documents. There are not really photos of it. Another which you can still experience, but not in the state that it was in 1965. One from the middle of the 20th century, one from the very end of the 19th century. And I'll talk about the particular reasons we've chosen these buildings in just a minute. Okay, so here's the Adelaide cyclorama. This was I've called it here a glimpse of a 19th century time travel building. This was a building in the middle of Adelaide on Hindley Street that you could go to, you pay some money and you would go in, and there was this big cyclorama, a panorama. You could stand in the middle of it. It was basically a giant painting, but much, much larger than almost any other painting in the world at the time. And this was a particular late 19th century form of media, but they are rare and they're not as spectacular as they were at the time. So I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm interested in this as a way of thinking about their attempts at the time to create a virtual environment. Now we do with headsets and software. At the time it was done with, you make a huge building and you put a very detailed painting inside of it. What was that experience like? Well, we're aiming to find out. Okay, the other building that we're looking at is Bonython House. This was designed by one of the premier modernist architects in Adelaide, and was an attempt to develop a new modern architectural language. And I'll show you some photos of it in just a minute. It's a really spectacular and interesting building for the ways that it was used to display art. So here's some photographs from the 60s of what Bonython House looked like. And you can see there's a tremendous amount of art up and down both of the walls, sculpture in the middle. So one of the things we're wanting to talk about is how can you can, of course, build this building in virtual reality, but how can we insert these artifacts, these artworks in there and understand the way that the building itself affects the way that we apprehend these works of art. And they had this very unusual fireplace in the middle. So this project is a little bit further along than the cyclorama one. And you can see we've got the historical data. Architecture has built plans of what the house looked like, models of what it's looked like, and our Realities Extended team, led by Steve Cook, has then gone and created virtual environments that you'll see. This is the early stages, but they'll be populated with those artworks, and you'll be able to walk through the house and see what it looked like at the time the art was in there. So there's an early version of the fireplace. And you can see the Realities Extended logo here at the end. I'm sure Steve can talk about their work in a few minutes. So that's one of them, looking at how does the building itself structure the experience of art. The cyclorama is another experience of art, and here's a an illustration of what one was like around the time. Okay, so you can see there's a big painting and a platform that you stand in the middle of. This was on Hindley Street. If you went to Hindley Street, you would get, you could go in and get this brochure, which has a picture of what it looked like on the front. Now the beautiful kind of Victorian basilica and things here on this was the facade. In the back, and you'll be able to see it in a minute, the cyclorama was basically a big barn. Okay, and I just wanted to show you a page from this booklet, which is one of the historical sources we're using, because on every other page it would have an ad. So here's Hardy Wines, and then it would have some historical information about the cyclorama. You'd get this map that would tell you, here's what you're looking at on the cyclorama, of course, with ads all around it as well. And I think this is important to think about, the building itself wasn't just about cultural heritage. It was about being part of the city, and it had a big commercial aspect to it as well. So we managed to locate the plans of the original cyclorama, and as you can see, it was basically a barn. There's not a lot going on there compared to Bonython House, which is significantly more detailed. So we're Amit and the architecture team are pulling together a model of what this would have looked like from the 19th century documents. I'm going to show you as well, we obviously don't, the canvas that the image, which it was Jerusalem at the time of the crucifixion, and this canvas was destroyed. What we do have are images of it from a book. So this canvas was reproduced in plates in a book that we've tracked down. So I'm going to show you just briefly what this kind of would look like. I've just put this together in PowerPoint with our scans from the book. So you can see we're in Jerusalem, and you can imagine if you're in the cyclorama turning around, this is a little bit what it would look like. So these are the images that we're going to use for the model, because we don't have the actual canvas itself, which would have been much more detailed. But these prints give us kind of an idea of what it would have looked like. So, kind of dramatic here would be lots going on. You can see the walls of Jerusalem, right, the people who would have been around at the time. You get a sense of the local flora and fauna. And this is what architecture are working on building us models of. So again, it's a great big barn, but the way the light would have come into the building is an important part of the model. And these will then go to the Realities Extended team, who will rebuild a virtual cyclorama. So we're thinking here about how does recreating the 19th century virtual reality in 21st century virtual reality help us to sort of process that sense of apprehension and how that maybe has changed over time, and what is the future of that. So can looking at the virtual reality past in the present give us a sense of what virtual reality might be in the future? How can looking at those, the way that Bonython House presented artworks, how does looking at that in virtual reality give us a sense of what it would have actually been like? And through all of this, we're looking at the ways that our different teams can come together and bring our discipline-specific knowledge about architecture, about presenting material in virtual reality, and discovering those historical documents that are necessary for it. I think that's all I have. And I think we have a few minutes for questions. So I'll invite Steve and Amit to join me. And I'll stop the share of my screen here so we can bring them on. Hi, Steve. Hi, Amit. I guess the first thing I asked you is, is there anything you want to correct me on here?
I think you summed up everything perfectly, Aaron.
Great, thanks. Amit, maybe do you want to just give us, from your perspective, what have the challenges been for architecture, and what are the research questions you guys are working with?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Well, I'm guessing everybody else is just as excited about the sort of cyclorama particular project. So when Aaron told me about it, I was like, wow, this is amazing. And the whole idea of sort of connecting 19th century virtual reality kind of approach to 21st century. So that's really an exciting one. But I think I want to talk a little bit about the other project, which otherwise seems quite, regular and mundane to sort of look at a normal suburban house. And of course, as people in architecture, we're interested in the house for other reasons as well, because it's part of a type of modernist architecture that was developing here in Adelaide. But the interesting thing with something like that is that even though the house itself exists, its function has changed quite a bit. It is still residential, but when the original owners are in there, it is acting almost like an art gallery. And I think that's really what this is trying to capture, and which I think is really important for us. So earlier this year, one of our colleagues, James Curry, who's also working on this project along with me from architecture department, had an exhibition at the State Library, which was looking at modernist houses in Adelaide. And so we do things like that where we try to capture it. And often that results in looking at old plans or photographs, yeah. But I think in architecture, one of the other things that we are really interested in is how the space is animated by an event. So, so there's this space itself and the quality of space in terms of its materiality and things which you can replicate for an exhibition, but how do you capture that animated event that was happening within it? So which is what we are, from our disciplinary perspective, that's what we're hoping that this will help us achieve, working with people in media, working with people in immersive media to sort of say, well, how that same space completely changes, because currently you can go to that house, we can organize a visit, but of course it's used as a living room, a sitting room, and it's a completely different feel about it, different sort of lighting, different sort of textures, as opposed to the couple of images that you saw. And of course, the models look quite bare right now, but hopefully when we have everything in there, you can see the richness of the textures. And the interesting thing about that one was that it was one of the biggest sort of collections of modern Australian art. So it's also very specific to our context. So I think that from our perspective, that's really where the value of this research lies for us, is how we can talk about architecture, not just in terms of its structure, its material, its overall shape and form, but also the capturing the event that happened in it in time and reproduce that for a 21st century audience.
I think there's some really interesting things to think about as well in terms of the way that our understanding of art changed, from 1890s to, the 1960s, where, once you have modernism is really well established and modes of representation are very different. And I think even connecting back then, to our colleagues in the first presentation, how does that change in the 1990s when now, the art is digital, it exists on, on floppy disks, which we thought at the time as being somewhat immaterial, but of course do have their own materiality, but not a different kind of physical presence. So I think that I may have undersold the Banathan House part, but I think it's really interesting, and I can't wait to see what it looks like with that modern Australian art in the space as well.
I think it was considered one of the largest private collections in Australia. So there's a huge thing there, and like there's I don't have copies here with me, but there's like 4 or 5 books just on that sort of collection that went through that house over the years. Of course, we'll only be able to recreate a little snippet in time, but I think that's really important. But that's the thing from an architect's perspective, we are always interested in how the shell that we create, the lighting and the texture, how it affects the experience of things inside. So that's what we're hoping that, this sort of immersive VR model is going to help people understand and value these buildings. Otherwise, people go, all right, well, yes, it's a modernist piece, but a lot of modernist architecture looks similar. And it's like, well, once you experience it internally, you can recognize aspects of it which you can't from photographs and drawings itself. Yeah.
And I think experiencing it is part of the beauty of this particular project, and it's not just experiencing the architecture, being able to roam around that particular building, and get a sense of its physical presence, but in context. So having those art pieces in this virtual world, being able to experience that is something quite special. So yeah, it's a very interesting project and idea.
I wanted to ask you from your side, Steve, but I think we've got a question as well. Peter, did you have a question?
Yes, hello. I'm Peter Scriver, a colleague of Amit's, and fascinated to see both presentations. But I just wanted to zoom in on things that Amit was pointing to. I was fascinated to see the wonderful work you're doing on the cyclorama, because it's so emphatically clear from at least our architectural eyes how it's being designed as a device to optimize the viewing of that painting, which of course is what you're aiming at, but it's so technical. Particularly interesting to me was the way it had the canopy above it, which it removed the direct sight of the daylight, which is all important to illuminate the image with the technology of the day, so to speak, with daylight, but to actually separate us technically, spatially, from engagement with the light, so that we're immersed in this virtual reality of being in biblical times in Jerusalem, with that bathing of South Australian light upon it. And so that highly technical, in a sense, ironically, sort of seeing the 19th century as the highly technical device. But then the contrast with the Bonython house is that it's this immersive environment that is, through modern architecture, is trying to immerse us, mobilize a whole sense of kind of engagement in a lived experience of art, and such as, again, Amit was pointing to. But we're fascinated as a research group to, we're constantly using both literally the technical device side of architecture, that it sets up an environment, manages light. We think a lot about how you actually design that to work and to optimize the visual experience. But it's also just taken for granted, each in its own historical period. We expect a building to be a building, and the common person just sort of takes that for granted. So it's this sort of lens, in the same way that more and more, of course, we're immersed in our visual worlds through whatever device we use perennially, so that we don't notice it anymore. And I think this is, in our research, we're constantly trying to articulate, at least from our scholarly point of view, awareness of how much the design of this everyday environment, or in the case of the Bonython house, what was sort of extraordinary in its moment, to kind of allow us to see the world differently, but through these happenstance kind of facts of the design of the environment around us. The fact that ordinary persons like us all, we all live in houses, we all live in environments, we all live in architecture, but few of us recognize that architecture is everywhere. They sort of see those individual standout objects as iconic things that catch our attention, that we consider to be architecture. But it's just sort of this everydayness of it, which we're fascinated to kind of understand better. So I think this collaboration with you, with your media sensitivity to the all of these questions from the technology and the software and the other points of view is really aiding our project richly. I'm really excited to see this pairing of projects, and so this is a long comment, but great.
Thanks, Peter. I might just step in here and ask Taryn and Kimberley to join us as well, because feel free to ask questions of any of our panelists. And I'm actually pleased to see a couple of questions from Taryn and Kimberley appearing in the chat here from my view anyway. I just had, Taryn's asked something and I'm going to put this perhaps to Steve, where it's curious about the degree of experiential authenticity that the cyclorama reproduction will entail. So are you aiming to include the commercial aspects? And one thing that struck out to me was the sound of the crowd. I imagine it would be quite rare to experience the cyclorama in quiet. And I think I see that, like some of the snapshots of VR experience that Aaron shared earlier. I think what we're seeing, and actually I think this is interesting across both projects, I think we're seeing a maturity coming into these digital projects that says, just making it digital and looking at it isn't enough. It's not capturing the experience. And the sound is something that immediately stood out to me as something you want to capture. But yeah, Steve, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. So the short answer would be that we haven't actually discussed anything about sound replication. The long answer is that in previous projects where I've looked at historical visualization, especially 3D capture of physical spaces, we have actually replicated reverberation of the room, and we have put sound in that mimics exactly the sorts of sounds that would be in those spaces. What we have found is that sometimes when we do put sound in that is somewhat artificially present, and by that I mean, let's say we do have a crowd sound, but there is no crowd in a virtual space, that can actually be in itself disorienting. So we've got to be quite selective about how sound is put in, how various sorts of stimuli are put into these virtual worlds, because they should really mimic what's happening, not just within the space itself, but within the context or activity or interaction within that space too. I guess that's something we can discuss though, guys. I'm looking at you, Aaron, and Amit there. Perhaps we can have a discussion about sound, but I think we'd have to tread quite carefully about how to implement sound at this stage, especially because we aren't looking at crowd replication as one example.
I do see
the interesting.
Sorry,
We do know that there were concert performed, or there was like musical accompaniment for the cyclorama, but we're not sure what it sounded like. We haven't found any scores or any instruction. So we know that there absolutely, and I love that question, was that media aspect was there. And I guess that goes to the question as well, what can you preserve and what can't you preserve?
And also what's technically feasible. So at the moment we're targeting Snapdragon XR2 chipsets, so mobile headsets. Normally if I was doing an orchestral score, I'd be streaming that direct from disk, and I don't want to get too technical here, but it's kind of important to, and I think Taryn, you said it too, there's a rabbit hole that you can go down on the technical side. I don't want to do that. But, I think there will be limitations as to what kinds of, like, if we have an orchestral score, how long would it be? Where's the loop point? Is that going to be seamless? Should we be streaming that, direct from the disk? And by that, I mean that memory on board the headset, or how should we be storing it? So, yeah, there are a lot of questions there about that. I think authenticity is another thing. If we have an orchestral score, it really should be relevant to that particular context. How we can get that information, I don't know. Preservation is a bit of a topic that we seem to be touching upon here. And I think, Kimberley, you had a question about preservation of what this build might actually be too. So if without having the correct information on an orchestral score, should we be putting something in? I don't know.
Yeah, there's a big philosophical discussion there about, putting the real thing in, or putting something that might be like, or that maybe even making a choice that would be more evocative of a time that in our interpretation of it, but it is all an interpretation. But we're really running out of time today, so I'm sorry we haven't had a huge amount of time for questions. But I really just want to make sure I thank all of these speakers. I found both presentations really fascinating. So thank you very much for joining us and sharing these today. I'm just going to, before we go, I'd also like to thank Karen, who has been our technical support behind the scenes there and keeping an eye on things. Before we sign off, I'd just like to share some information about our next webinar, which will be the last one for the year, and that'll be on Tuesday, the 1st of November at 2 p.m. In that session, we're going to hear from two projects that are doing interesting things with collections. One of the presentations will be the winner of the CoLab Digital Cultural Fellowship, which is a fellowship supported by the South Australian Museum, History Trust, State Library and the Art Gallery, who will be sharing their data storytelling project that is connecting digitised collections with other sources of data to tell a rich story of the River Murray over time. And we'll also be joined by one of the creators of Skullbook, an ANU initiative that provided 3D digital models of skeletal remains from the ANU anatomy collections that are being used for research and educational purposes. As attendees have registered for this webinar, we will send the link to register those things, register out to all of the people who've signed up today. And I thank you very much for joining us, and a very special thank you to our speakers.